Hello and welcome to episode 64 of Linux After Dark. I'm Joe.
I'm Chris.
I'm Gary.
And I'm Dalton.
Welcome back, chaps. So today we're going to talk about ARM, and specifically ARM laptops and Linux. And this came up because, Gary, you bought yourself an Arm Chromebook, and initially you were very positive about it, but then it all went wrong.
Yeah, and it all went wrong not because of the ARM Linux bit. I probably should preface this with that. It went wrong because of Lenovo's awful hardware QA for consumer products. Obviously was running Chrome OS on the Chromebook, but with all of the Linux compatibility layer stuff. And I took that machine on a 2-week-long trip to Ireland, and it was the only machine I took. And to be honest with you, having the Linux apps that I'm familiar with and I enjoy using, mixed with the Chrome OS stuff, mixed with a few Android apps here and there, it was the perfect machine to travel with. And every single application I needed, despite the fact that Crostini was Debian 11, I think, was available. So I was using VS Code to get some basic code stuff done. SSH was there. I could even run Firefox inside Crostini and play back 1080p video with no issues on a low-powered Chromebook device. It really, really was good. Yeah, it was just let down by Lenovo's hardware, unfortunately.
Or did it fall to bits?
Yeah, so it was one of the detachable Chromebook tablets, and after about 3 weeks, the detachable keyboard stopped working because the ribbon cable inside it broke, presumably. So, yeah, that was not brilliant because it was obviously designed to be attached and detached.
Falling to bits was a feature.
Yeah, seemingly so. It just became a tablet rather than a two-in-one thing.
So were there not any proprietary apps that weren't available?
I don't really use that many proprietary apps on Linux, but everything that I tried that I use regularly was compiled, or I could use it in a browser, or I could use the Android version of the app.
Android, of course.
Yeah, which is, I think, probably what made it such a nice device to use, because I couldn't really get a version of Telegram working properly. But because I could use it in the browser, or just use the Android version from the Play Store, it meant that I wasn't actually missing that proprietary app because I just used the version that I'd use on the phone.
But Chrome OS isn't Linux.
Well, no, but the Debian container is.
Well, and Chrome OS is Linux. I don't care what anyone says. I don't care what Jim from 2.5 Admin says.
Oh, man, cage match.
And as Gary says, once you're inside Crostini, it feels a lot like any other Debian CLI, and then you have a graphical user interface for applications as well. So it's not like it feels total shit Linux when you're in Crostini, for sure. I mean, I've used it. I don't choose to use it, but the thing that Gary said is, has been Debian 11 until I think last week or the week before. You can now upgrade it to 12 to Bookworm. But yeah, it's been a while since you returned the device, I think, Gary.
Yeah, it's been a few months, I think, since I returned it at this point, and it's just been on the list of things to record.
Shh, don't tell him.
It's revealing the secrets.
And the other thing is that the Chrome OS Crostini experience did really nicely. And I don't want to just turn this into a Chrome OS thing because it's supposed to be an ARM Linux thing, but all of the applications that I installed in Debian just had a launcher in Chrome OS. And when I first booted the machine, there was maybe 10 seconds of delay whilst the Debian container spun up. But that's not really any worse than starting a snap of Firefox, is it? So it worked pretty well. The Debian container started up and all the rest of the launchers of the applications were just like I was running them on bare metal. Now, it was a relatively low-end Snapdragon CPU, but it was perfectly serviceable for the things I needed.
Was it 8 gigs of RAM then?
Yeah, it was 8 gigs of RAM and 120 gig eMMC. So it performed exactly like you'd expect a machine of that kind of spec to perform.
Right, because I remember trying it on my Chromebook R11, which I think has got 4 gigs of RAM and a pretty weak Celeron in it. And it was a bit painful, really. I don't think I could use it day to day. So it's interesting that even with a relatively low spec ARM processor, it was fine.
Yeah, I mean, I could tell that I wasn't on my full i7 ThinkPad or on an M series Mac, right? Like, it was definitely noticeable, but it was certainly as good as running any of the native Chrome OS stuff, I would say.
But then again, you did use an X200 ThinkPad and said it was fine. So I think your standards are pretty low.
This is true. Yeah, I did daily the T400 for about a week with a Core 2 Duo, and I got away with it. So perhaps I'm not the best test of anything performance related.
So what if you want to have a laptop running proper Linux that is ARM? There aren't that many options, are there?
What do you mean? Apple have a whole series of machines that can do that now.
Oh.
And they're very cheap, sort of. It's funny because over the last few weeks, this topic came back up because Phoronix highlighted a talk at FOSDEM, which I don't think you went to, Gary, did you, while you were there? But it was from Neil Armstrong, who's from Linaro, and he works closely with Qualcomm for their ARM SoCs. And so I watched the talk and had a look, and things do seem to be improving. They're on the 3rd gen of the Snapdragon 8. What was in your one, Gary? The Snapdragon 3rd gen 8?
I would have to check, to be honest.
Yeah, so the X13S, we had Mark Pearson from Lenovo on the show a while ago. That's got the Gen 3 in it. They are trying to take an upstream first approach, which is different from previously, where it was much more akin to a smartphone. You're talking about, picking a kernel version, wedging a load of proprietary firmware blobs in, testing, wedging it again. And by the time you release the device, you're 3 years down the line into the life cycle of that kernel version. It's definitely an interesting talk. There's loads of more development boards, and they do seem to be trying to put the work in. But as you said, Joe, when I brought it up, it's the lack of range in devices and the cost of them as well.
Yeah, it's about 1,800 quid for that ThinkPad, the X13S, which is a lot of money to drop on something that is not 100% Linux-wise.
And I think I said at the time when I watched the talk at the Ubuntu Summit in Prague in 2022, I would be the first person to go and buy that machine if it had proper Linux support. But when we were speaking behind the scenes, it's like 1,800 quid is a lot of money to drop on a machine that even 2 years down the line doesn't have full support. A lot of things like the webcam still doesn't work, for example, or I think there were a few other limitations you listed, Chris, that just feel like sure, I could probably install 2404 on it and get by, but 1,800 quid? That feels like a lot of money.
And it's the same with the Apple laptops, because it's a very good experience and the Asahi team have done an amazing job of it. But there's still a couple of little things like video out, which is being worked on to some extent and works, I think, now on some of the models, but it's not rock solid like you'd get with most x86 laptops now.
It's not, but I can get a refurbished MacBook Air for a third of the price of that ThinkPad. Like, you can get an M1 Air for 600 quid refurbs now.
Wow.
Which makes it a much better proposition.
I think that's the thing that's been missing with a lot of ARM hardware to use with Linux is the convergence of all of this happens when the hardware gets cheap enough that hobbyists are actually able to buy it, so it's not new anymore. But also there are enough people out there with them that anyone gives a damn about them.
I think that's the struggle, isn't it, with the ARM laptops that aren't the Macs, is that they're just not selling in vast numbers yet. So there aren't many of them on the second-hand market. I can't think that many large corporates are going out and buying a load of X13S. I could be wrong.
Or indeed the Surface X.
Yeah, or the Surface X, or any of those kind of mainstream ARM laptops. So they're not showing up on eBay for people like us to buy to tinker with at reasonable prices.
Yeah, I had a look on eBay for an X13S and there just weren't any at all. There was loads of accessories and batteries and all that kind of stuff, but there was no actual devices at all.
Yeah, the presentation was quite heavy on the developer board side of things, and not to do them a disservice, because there's lots of good stuff in here. There's lots of hardware that's supported, and they are working on the camera, but there is a bit of a caveat where it's behind closed doors. So I don't know whether there's intellectual property issues. Again, it comes down to firmware blobs, probably, things like that. But that is an improvement from when Mark spoke to us, where he thought that might not ever work. They do have a 2310 image that they say will install as is, but then there's a sub point, may require some slight configurations. So there's a Fedora wiki page for the ThinkPad X13S, which is quite detailed, quite developed. So it has moved on a little bit, but we're still stuck a bit, aren't we? Because there are ARM devices available and have been for a while, but they tend to have a compromise in performance, for example. You're like, yeah, this is cool. It's ARM. It's a different architecture, but it's not going to blow anything out of the water in terms of its performance. It's frustrating because I think you said, Gary, if someone came out with a device like this, we would be there, take my money, like around the right price point with enough of it working, but it still feels a little bit not there.
Right. You don't want to pay full price for something that isn't 100%. You don't want to pay low price for something that really doesn't have the performance anyway, so why would you even want it in your home? And there aren't enough of them to get in between those two.
Yeah, that's the tricky thing. I mean, the Chromebook I had the Snapdragon 7C Gen 2, which by all accounts is not particularly performant, but it was good enough that I could get by for being the machine that I took on a road trip. Whereas anything less than that probably isn't going to happen, and anything more than that is way, way too expensive to justify unless it's going to be completely working and is going to replace my existing laptop.
You lot promised me this would not devolve into a negative segment about how ARM on Linux is just a lost cause. So give me some positivity here. Is there any hope?
Well, so at least from the software side, what surprised me when I was using it, actually both on Fedora Asahi and on the Chromebook, is that most of the software I need is there. So I think Popey talked in Linux Matters recently about the Telegram client and that actually just needs a very light rebuild in order to get running. So that's pretty easy.
A light rebuild that takes 45 minutes on a MacBook Air.
Well, yeah, but it's a MacBook Air, right? It doesn't have active cooling and all the rest of it. It'd probably be quicker.
The light rebuild is probably rebuilding all of Qt.
Quite possibly.
Yes.
Potentially Electron.
But most of the apps I needed did work, or there was a browser-based alternative to them. So actually, software selection-wise, I think I could get by. I could run Firefox. There are builds of Chromium for ARM64 now. Telegram client obviously is a slight aside, but I can use web.telegram. VS Code works fine. Most things I need are available software-wise. So I think we are pretty much there from a FOSS software stack side of things. So that's at least a positive, because we certainly weren't a couple of years ago.
I think the power move of running Firefox on a Chromebook is just too good to not emphasize.
Well, I was keen to do that when I tried this out a couple of years ago on that Chromebook R11, and it was very satisfying.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't as performant as Chrome, but it was also running in an LXD container, so it was fine, given that there was no graphics acceleration or anything.
I guess there's no reason why it would be that much different for things that are in, say, Debian or Ubuntu's repository. The ports tree basically ensures that all that stuff is building. It might not work entirely, but there's a lot of industry support behind getting a lot of especially embedded stuff on ARM64, and a lot of them want to use Ubuntu anyway, so there's really no reason why it wouldn't work at this point.
A lot of that stuff is helped by the hyperscaler clouds having ARM instances available as well, right? If they're going to allow you to deploy an Ubuntu machine with an ARM CPU, then they've got to support it. So everything in the ports repository that you run on a server at least has got to work.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by Kolide. When you go through airport security, there's one line where the TSA agent checks your ID and another where a machine scans your bag. The same thing happens in enterprise security, but instead of passengers and luggage, it's end users and their devices. These days, most companies are pretty good at the first part of the equation, where they check user identity, but user devices can roll right through authentication without getting inspected at all. In fact, a huge percentage of companies allow unmanaged, untrusted devices to access their data. That means an employee can log in from a laptop that has its firewall turned off and hasn't been updated in 6 months. Or worse, that laptop might belong to a bad actor using employee credentials. Kolide finally solves the device trust problem. Kolide ensures that no device can log into your Okta-protected apps unless it passes your security checks. Plus, you can use Kolide on devices without MDM, like your Linux fleet, contractor devices, and every BYOD phone and laptop in your company. So support the show and go to kolide.com/LinuxAfterdark to watch a demo and see how it works. That's kolide.com/LinuxAfterdark. Quick bit of admin then. First of all, thank you everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to linuxafterdark.net/support. And for either $5 or $10 a month on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed of either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And if you want to get in contact with us, you can email show@linuxafterdark.net. Let's do some feedback then. Carl writes, love the podcast generally, but particularly the episode with the discussion on the Wyse 5070, which I've been using as a home server for a while now. I agree with all the praise you heaped on it for certain use cases. One thing though, you can have 2 SSDs if you use an adapter in the AE-keyed M.2 slot, the one used for Wi-Fi and other add-ons. By the way, I'm Carl from the mods tab on the Parky Towers page for the 5070, my 15 minutes of fame.
Yeah, this is a very good point. It's got a lot of detail if you go to the mods tab there. One thing I would say is we did have another email in, we won't read it out. A very, very grand plan for the Wyse 5070 as a NAS with lots of storage hanging off it. Be careful of PCIe lanes. I can't stress it enough. That's the one thing. It's a very cheap box. It doesn't go that far. 2 SSDs is fine. You get, I think, a PCIe X1 slot. And you have to either use a stubby little SSD or the adapter in the picture is with a flexible cable. But yeah, this, the J5005 or the J4125, 4105, all of those Gemini Lake ones, if you push the PCI lanes, you're going to run out very quickly. I think it's got 6 and they don't have a discrete controller on them. So look, it's £30. Get your money's worth. Put 2 SSDs in, that's fine. But don't push it beyond that.
I think it's the same with a lot of those lower-end Intel CPUs. I think I mentioned before that I rebuilt my main home server with an N100 CPU. And while it's been great, I wanted to add in an M.2 SATA controller. So I could put 6 disks in it because it only had one onboard SATA port. And that's fine. But then what I wanted to do was, for various reasons, add a dual port to 1 gig network card. And I've definitely noticed that sharing of PCIe lanes, where if I'm pushing 2 gig through the Ether channel trunk, it is a bit slower writing to the disks than it otherwise would be. So I think it's worth bearing in mind with any of these low-end systems. You will hit limitations with them. It just depends on how comfortable you are with that trade-off. But like you say, for 30 quid, you can't really complain.
I'm very glad you brought that up, Gary, because only last week I was watching, there's a YouTube channel called Hardware Haven, I think, and he looks at the Zima Cube, which he got a preview model of, and the one problem it had was, pushing the PCIe lanes, and you're playing whack-a-mole with the number available. Now, he corrects his own video halfway through because they revised the motherboard and they amended the PCIe lane layout to allow it to have a bit more mileage. But these are good chips, but you can't push them too far. There is a limit.
Yeah, I think that's the problem, is that they are, by and large, designed for embedded applications or low-end netbook type laptops, right? They're not really built for us running home servers on. The issue is that those CPUs have gotten so good. Like the N100, I'm fairly sure, is about the same performance as the 8th gen i5 mobile chips. So like there's a fair bit of performance in it, and I've got 32 gigs of RAM in that machine, and it's pretty speedy, but it was never built for this. It was built for someone running Windows 10 S edition with Edge and not much else open. So I think you just need to be aware of what it actually is you're buying, even though the chips have come a really long way in the last few years.
Can I take a bit of the sheen off the Wyse 5070?
Oh, yeah.
The onboard NIC doesn't play nicely with the Ubuntu LTS kernel, it seems. I've heard reports of it completely freezing, and sure enough, probably about once a week, I can't SSH into mine and I have to go and unplug it and plug it back in again. I haven't looked at the logs. I don't know why it's doing it. I'm just assuming that it's this NIC problem. It's not really an issue for me. It's a secondary backup box. And it's also the Jellyfin server, but I haven't really been watching much stuff recently. I've not had time. So I think that is a potential issue with that box.
Realtek welcome to the world of Realtek NICs. Under BSD, historically, they've been a real nightmare, but Gary said that has improved, but you sometimes come a cropper. I mean, they are 10 a penny cheap NICs, and sometimes you can have a DKMS driver. There are modules that aren't DKMS. The Eddie Murphy NAS I have, it wouldn't do gigabit when I first got it. And the only way to resolve that was to bump the kernel version up. What I would say is it's my router. I've got 2 Realtek NICs in mine as my router on symmetric 500 fiber, and it hasn't fallen over ever. What can I say? Intels are better, but they aren't in things like a Wyse 5070 because it would push the price of the BOM up. So again, 30 quid, mate.
Well, yeah, 30 quid means I have to go and unplug it and plug it back in once a week.
Yeah, which is, again, it's a trade-off, right? And it's probably one you're willing to make to spend a third of the cost of a new machine.
Yeah.
I mean, mine is running, like you said, Chris, BSD, and it's also my router. And the only thing I've had to do is install a slightly different driver for the Realtek cards, because when I was downloading Linux ISOs and really pushing the connection, it was a bit weird. Like, it would just panic and stop passing traffic, but I could still get to the web UI. Really strange. But since I changed the driver, absolutely fine. I can absolutely saturate 500 down, 100 up connection all day. No issues.
I think this is it, isn't it? And I remember someone succinctly in the OpenWRT forums putting it when it comes to these NICs. Intel, and to a degree Broadcom ones, even though there's issues with the open nature of them, they test the hardware and they put things in the hardware to be good at networking. Realtek, they just don't give a shit. It's mitigated by a huge, passionate volunteer network of people improving kernel modules and drivers and firmware, not coming from Realtek necessarily. It's frustrating. I would never touch a Realtek Wi-Fi card, for example, because fuck that. I'm going to put an Intel one in. And I hate the fact that they're starting to get soldered onto the board now.
But the bottom line again is, it wasn't made for this.
Yeah.
It was never built to be a machine that is on 24 hours a day.
Running Linux. It was never meant to run Linux.
Yeah, right.
24 hours a day it would be, because it's a thin client, so it's left on. But yeah, it's running it is an appliance. It comes with ThinOS. Dell made ThinOS. They give you a 3-year support contract. If you report bugs because you bought one, they'll fix them, but they're end of life. That's where they're 30 quid from the back of a van.
Right, well, we'd better get out of here then. We'll be back in a couple of weeks, but until then, I've been Joe.
I've been Chris.
I've been Gary.
And I've been Dalton.
See you later.